A Roman aristocrat's dating life might sound a little familiar, but there are also plenty of differences. So here's what it would have been like to date someone in ancient Rome. If you've ever been to Rome, you may have noticed that they're really into the kissing thing. Many people found their future spouses while out with friends at parties, banquets, taverns, and brothels. There were lots of scammers and con artists working the streets of Rome, especially those targeting foreigners unfamiliar with the city. But be careful, because things didn't always go as planned. For the first few centuries of the empire, the average age of marriage for men was 30 to 35, while women were allowed to pleasure themselves and even initiate sexual activity. They were held to a higher standard than men. When it came to fidelity, after all, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was filled with lots of passionate trysts. Men were allowed to have affairs, but women who engaged in extramarital sex were considered adulteresses and could be killed for their actions. That's why it's so fitting that so many Roman statues end up in compromising positions. It's a subtle nod to the double standard of their time. Women typically married a bit earlier, around the age of 25. That doesn't mean that people didn't start dating much younger. In fact, according to a survey conducted by the Roman statesman Pliny the Younger, most men began having sex around the age of 18, while women lost their virginity closer to 16. Some Roman men continued to sow their wild oats well into their adult lives. While adultery was frowned upon, there were plenty of opportunities for a married Roman to stray from time to time. As we mentioned, parties and banquets were common, and these events were often full of alcohol, dancing, and beautiful people. It wasn't unusual for married men and women to flirt with each other, which could lead to temptation. Adultery was easier to get away with than it might seem today, too. Ancient Rome had no laws against contraception, abortion, or divorce, giving would-be lovers a lot of wiggle room. Plus, there was no concept of fidelity expected in a marriage. Both men and women could have affairs, and in some cases, both spouses would participate in threesomes together. So if you wanted to cheat on your partner, you wouldn't have to worry about breaking the law, getting an STD, or ruining your marriage. Just be careful not to get caught, because cheating could still hurt. Roman poet Catullus, previously mentioned for his love towards his male lover Lanudes, also wrote some of the most scathing poetry ever written about his sister's unfaithful husband. The collection of 15 poems known as the Catullan Invective spend a great deal of time insulting Lesbia's husband and accusing him of cheating. The last poem in the series has become famous in its own right, reading, "May your wife chew you up, may your sons choke on it. Now that's cold." Roman historian Livy tells the story of a Roman knight who went out one evening to meet a prostitute he'd been eyeing. He found her in a tavern, paid her for her company, and then went home with her. At some point during the night, he woke up. His wife wasn't in bed with him, nor was his money or jewelry. He'd been robbed. So it goes without saying, if you're going to sneak someone into your house in the middle of the night, maybe check to make sure they aren't a pickpocket first. To avoid getting swindled, it was best to stick with what you knew. If you were looking to marry, having your parents set you up with someone from a respectable family was the safest route. Marriages between people of equal status were preferred but not required. And wealthy families often arranged marriages between their children and the children of other wealthy families as a way of cementing alliances and maintaining their power and influence. While the idea of your parents setting you up on a blind date might fill you with dread, you should count yourself lucky. Back in ancient Rome, there were actually professional marriage brokers, people whose job it was to find suitable matches for their clients. While they were usually used by poorer folk, there were some cases of rich families hiring brokers to find suitable spouses for their children. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Like today, some people were just better at playing the field than others. So if you were too shy or busy to look for love on your own, it made sense to hire someone with experience. One advantage of having a large social network is that your friends would often know people you hadn't met yet, including potential love interests. Even if you didn't have many friends, the streets of Rome were always bustling with people, and there was no shortage of eligible bachelors and bachelorettes to approach. You could also find love in more exotic locations. People who worked in professions that took them away from Rome, such as merchants or soldiers, sometimes fell in love while traveling. Soldiers in particular were known for bringing home souvenirs like jewels, artwork, and most surprisingly perhaps, their foreign lovers. These military-inspired trysts were actually such a popular trope in Roman literature that there is a word for it, amores militares. The most famous example is probably the affair between Roman general Scipio Africanus and his captured Carthaginian love interest, Hannibal, in Massinissa. Though we'll probably never know how that story ended, since nobody wrote it down. I mean, even the statues of their gods and goddesses seem to be locked in an eternal state of lip-to-lip action. It wasn't just the Greeks who believed in kissing the person you love. They thought it was important for potential lovers to get up close and personal before making any kind of commitment. And this extended to same-sex relationships as well. According to Roman poet Catullus, the first thing he did after meeting his male lover, a young man named Leonidas, was to kiss him. Kissing was a way of getting to know someone better, literally tasting them to see if you were compatible. Amatory marriages, or marriages based on love rather than political strategy, often started with a series of kisses. Sometimes these kisses were chaste, sometimes they weren't. The poet Propertius describes sneaking a peek at his belovedess' mouth while she was asleep and then planting a kiss on her lips. Later, he writes of being unable to stop kissing her all over, including her neck, chin, and ears. So if you had a crush in ancient Rome, you better hope they felt the same way about kissing as you did, because a rejection could be excruciating. The poet Ovid wrote of one Lycoris who was so tormented by her love for her friend, his wife, that she says she would rather die than live through another instance of being rejected by her crush. That must have been a rough day at the mall. The ancient Romans were pretty into PDA. The ancient Romans also found love in all the usual places. Of course, when looking for love in all the wrong places, you had to make sure you weren't getting played. If you were a wealthy Roman looking for a new hobby, though, you could skip the middleman and scour the brothels and taverns yourself. Even when people did fall in love in ancient Rome, the relationship might not have lasted long. Sadly, despite being ahead of the times in so many ways, ancient Romans still had a double standard when it came to sex. So if you're trying to navigate the tricky world of ancient Roman dating, be prepared for a lot of kissing, a lot of betrayal, and make sure you're not too picky. Now let's compare to ancient Roman aristocrats to the dating life of medieval European aristocrats. What was it like to date in the Middle Ages? So let's talk about it. There are several variables at play here, because Europe is a big place and covers a lot of time. This meant that arranged marriages were fairly common since families wanted to ensure their children got the best possible match, someone with good breeding, so to speak. And it was perfectly acceptable for parents to begin negotiating marriage prospects for their children when the kids were still quite young. Love matches were certainly not out of the question, but the odds of them working out well were slim. There were plenty of stories of forbidden love resulting in tragedy, like the tale of Romeo and Juliet. Oh, you would move up in the world and gain access to a higher lifestyle? Now, don't get me wrong, life as a nun was not fun. You could, of course, become a monk, but that meant giving up on all physical pleasures. Knights errant were members of the medieval nobility who traveled around the countryside, usually with a retinue of squires and servants, engaging in warfare and acts of chivalry. Tournaments were events where knights would engage in mock battles, jousting and fighting with swords and shields. Medieval European aristocrats took their roles and responsibilities very seriously. It was a world of balls and tournaments, of courtship and ceremony, where every interaction had layers of meaning and every meeting was laden with expectations. While it may seem foreign to us today, it was a product of its time, shaped by the values, beliefs, and concerns of a bygone era. Marriages were not just about finding love. They were also about forging alliances and securing power. Tournaments were not just about testing skills. They were also about displaying prowess and courage. Chivalry was not just a romantic gesture. It was also a way of ensuring order and decorum in a rough-and-tumble world. These events were normally held in conjunction with a royal court and were attended by royalty and high-ranking nobles. Ladies of the court would be on hand to award prizes and acclaim the victors. They may have also participated in the selection of the contestants. They were basically professional soldiers of fortune, freelance mercenaries, if you will. And although they often fought on behalf of kings and queens, they were not employed by any particular ruler. They were free agents, so to speak. What this meant was that they often found themselves in situations where they had to entertain local nobility, which usually involved copious amounts of wine, and of course women. And trust me, monks back then were not allowed to goof off and play video games all day. They had chores to do and prayers to say. It was hard work being a monk. So if you were a guy who liked women and you weren't able to score, then you would probably just keep trying to woo the ladies. Back then, chivalry hadn't quite caught on yet, so men could be pretty forward with their advances. Basically, if a man wanted to bone a woman, he would just ask her father for permission. And if he was granted permission, then the two of them would consummate the relationship without necessarily being married. Again, it was frowned upon, but it happened. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were no joke. And if you showed any interest in men, then your fellow nuns might accuse you of being tempted by the devil. Remember, women weren't allowed to be alone with men. A woman's reputation was everything. If she was accused of being a witch, then her life as a nun was likely over. Back then, the three most common charges against accused witches were heresy, sorcery, and immorality. Immorality could mean that a nun was drinking too much or dressing too provocatively, but it could also mean that she was sleeping around. Basically, if a nun was having sex, then she could be charged with immorality. If your husband was killed in battle, then you were pretty much set for life. Noble widows were rarely left destitute. They were usually entitled to a generous pension. And since women couldn't own land, the widow would take over the estate and run it until her son came of age. And even if a couple did manage to defy their families, they were often frowned upon by society. Love affairs between people of different social classes were also looked down upon, unless, of course, the female was of noble birth. In that case, she would just be considered a soiled dove. For men, having a pure bloodline was also very important. However, beauty standards of the time were a bit different than they are today. In the 11th century, women's headdresses were very elaborate. They wore a fillet or a narrow band around their head, to which they attached flowing veils. These days, a woman who walked around with a veil on her head would probably be mistaken for a Muslim. But back then, it was the fashion. It was a status symbol, a sign that she was married. And unlike today, the veil covered both the hair and the face, leaving only a slit for the eyes. A woman's virginity was highly prized, and she could be put under close watch to make sure she didn't get frisky before her marriage. So women would go to great lengths to stay out of the sun. That's why you see many paintings of women holding fans. The fan protected their faces from the elements and helped to keep them cool. Also, pale skin meant that the wearer didn't have to work outside the house. In other words, she was of noble birth. The lower classes, who spent all day toiling in the fields, were often sunburnt and therefore unattractive. In fact, virginity was a prerequisite for women entering into a convent. If she wasn't a virgin, she could still marry and have children, but she couldn't become a nun. Women were also expected to remain pure after they were wed. Adultery was a sin, but it was also seen as a threat to the legitimacy of the male heir. Thus, in certain cases, a husband might imprison his wife for having an affair. We also need to remember that the Middle Ages were not one long, stagnant period of history. Europe went through some major changes between 476 and 1453. It would be a disservice to everyone involved if I tried to paint such a broad picture. So to keep things simple, this segment will focus on European aristocrats in the High Middle Ages, roughly between 1000 and 1300 AD, with an emphasis on France and England. By the way, while the term medieval is used quite often, people who lived back then wouldn't have called themselves medieval anything. They would simply call themselves Christians. In fact, the term medieval didn't come into popular use until the 18th century, when scholars started using it to describe the so-called Dark Ages. The idea being that there was a classical golden age in Greece and Rome, followed by a Dark Age, which was the Middle Ages, and then a more recent Renaissance, or rebirth of culture. So high society in this period began with the nobility and the clergy, the only two groups that had access to higher education. The upper rungs of the nobility had their pick of suitable matches within their own ranks. Like today, looks mattered a lot, especially for women. They wanted to look beautiful to attract a mate. Another beauty standard back then was a healthy complexion. So paleness of skin was considered attractive. Having said that, if you were a peasant girl and you managed to snag a nobleman for a husband, then your life would change dramatically. That being said, if you were a woman unlucky enough to find yourself widowed at a young age, then you might consider becoming a nun. If you were a guy and you couldn't get laid, then your options were far more limited. Knights errant were particularly famous for their forward attitudes towards women. As I mentioned earlier, men of noble birth often competed in tournaments, which were not only a test of skill, but also an opportunity to impress potential brides. Now, while it might seem like all of these events and customs were nothing more than a bunch of fun and games, they're actually quite serious business. All in all, the dating life of medieval European aristocrats was a complex and nuanced affair. Thank you for watching.